class. Welcome to LMC 2200. This is lecture 4, and today we're going to be talking about third wave feminisms. And the time period we'll be covering is about 1980 to about 2008 today. Okay, ready? Let's get going then. So what we're going to see is that, much like first and second wave feminisms, third wave feminisms assume that democratic societies still haven't caught up with their own ideas and that women still receive fewer sociopolitical rights and privileges than their male counterparts. So you probably won't be surprised to learn that many third wave feminists continued the work of their predecessors by arguing for and lobbying for and working for increased political representation and new legislation that will ensure true equality for all. At the same time, one of the most important things we're going to see is that third wave feminisms differ from their predecessors in that what's really central here isn't just political reform, but increasingly cultural reform as well. And in fact, cultural reform in some ways will become the centerpiece of third and eventually fourth wave feminisms. Now, obviously, all the feminisms we've studied to date link these two things, but earlier movements were defined primarily by a sense of women as woman. And you can say that with a capital W, a united political group with united political goals. By way of contrast, third wave feminists tend to emphasize both the multiplicity of women's cultural identities and the multiple goals that women might have as they seek to live long and prosper and to have better lives for themselves and their families and for everyone. Now, having said this, I think we're on the third hand here, third wave feminisms explore how all women and all men and all people, for that matter, are united through the experience of living in a technologically intensive world. All right, so third wave feminisms, in short, can be thought of as having two distinct characteristics. First, rather than assuming that all women experience the world in the same ways due to their biological similarities, third wave feminists look at intersectionality, at how women's racial, ethnic, and class allegiances provide them with a range of ways of experiencing the world, both for the better and the worse. Now, the term intersectionality was first introduced by lawyer Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, and she very much used it to talk specifically about the intersection of race and gender. And to this day, there are some people who really think that when you talk about intersectionality, those should be the two main identity points that you focus on. Having said that, what we've really seen, especially with fourth wave feminism, is a desire to use the term intersectionality even more broadly to talk about the multiple kinds of identities that can intersect with any one particular body and its experience of the world. All right, great. So that's our first point. Second, while earlier feminists did indeed acknowledge the impact of technology on the modern world, they usually either just dismissed it as less pressing than other legal and cultural issues, or sometimes they would even assume, for better or for worse, that technology was the domain of men and that it would get elided with patriarchy and masculinity. And so it didn't seem to necessarily be something that was of particular interest or use to women. However, with the advent of a high-tech global capitalism, third wave feminists began to argue that the relationship between technology and gender might actually be one of the defining issues for women and, again, for all people in the modern world. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the crucial events leading to the third wave of feminism. As we know from our unit on second wave feminisms, there were, of course, already internal factors that were transforming feminism in the 1960s and 70s, right? And just to quickly remind you, you may remember that while most second wave feminists did indeed tend to still think about women as woman as a universal category, we were already seeing lesbian and Black feminists say, actually our experiences are diverse. They're not always the same as straight white women's experiences, and that we might eventually have to start rethinking what constitutes the people of feminism. So that's going to inform third wave feminism. But there are also three external factors that also really encourage the shift from second to third wave feminism as well. So the first of these is the rise of Reaganism and the return of conservative governments across the West in general. And so what you see is that around 1980, there's a shift in governments and suddenly there's literally a conservative, a holding in, a sort of attempt to gather in the forces of various nations in the face of a massively changing world. So in particular, what you're going to see is that governments are focusing on the last gasp of the Cold War. Not that they necessarily knew it was going to be the last gasp at that point, but it seemed like the Cold War was beginning to heat back up a little bit. And then, of course, it will end with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. But until then, there's this emphasis on the Cold War, and also a sense of urgency about thinking about how economies and nations are being transformed as we move into an increasingly global and high-tech world where we no longer have nation-dependent economies, but really a global capitalist economy. Not surprisingly, what you'll see is as these new governments come in and face these new challenges, there's going to be a shift in government priorities. And we certainly saw this in the United States. So Ronald Reagan's administration introduced tax reforms for the highest brackets. And really what this meant was that there were major tax cuts in 1981 and then in the 1986 Tax Reform Act, if I'm remembering correctly. And the theory was that if we cut taxes for the wealthiest people in America, that we could then have something called trickle-down economics. And the benefits would trickle down to everyone in the United States. As Reagan liked to say, quoting John F. Kennedy actually, the rising tide would lift all boats. All right, so that's one of the first things that's happening is we're seeing this sort of tax reform. Reagan assured people that the loss in tax revenue could easily be made up by cutting unnecessary non-defense programs, because such cuts would only harm the bureaucrats who ran the programs and who were often seen as their prime beneficiaries. However, it turned out that Reagan's tax cuts effectively destroyed many of the social programs that had been put in place in the prior 20 years and thus negated social gains that had been made by women, and especially feminists, in the previous 2 decades. All right, so that's one of the things you're going to see happening. Along with Reaganism, actually, there's another loop in here I wanted to mention, is that while governments are focusing on the Cold War and looking at the rise of global capitalism, there's also, again, I want to go back to the Cold War here, there was a sense that we were going to have to protect ourselves and use these new sciences and technologies, computer-enabled sciences and technologies, to fight the Cold War. And as many of you know, Reagan put a lot of money into the Space Defense Initiative, which was sometimes called the Star Wars Initiative. And so that was another reason why money had to be found somewhere. So between cutting taxes for the rich and then moving money out of social support programs and into military programs, that money had to come from somewhere. And like I said, it tended to come from the kinds of programs that feminists and other progressive political people had agitated for and worked for in the previous 20 years. Okay, so that's one of the big events. The other event, which I've just mentioned briefly, but I'm going to talk about a little bit more, is the advent of global capitalism, what sometimes is called third stage capitalism or late stage capitalism or multinational capitalism. You'll hear all these different phrases. I think global capitalism makes the most sense, and so that's the one I'm going to go with. So as probably a lot of you already know, the move toward a multinational economic system can actually be seen as early as World War II. But the real impact of automation, computerization, and global communication networks truly became most evident in the late 1970s and 1980s. On the home front, personal technologies such as the Walkman, video games, and the home computer changed interpersonal communication patterns and the rhythms of daily lives in ways that we hadn't seen since the late 1700s and the rise of industrialism. So really the other thing is people talk about this period as the shift from industrialism to post-industrialism. Now, that's not to say that there isn't still industry out there, but we don't tend to think of factories as our dominant spaces for producing things. Now, of course, we tend to think about places like Google, let's say, or Facebook or Twitter, right? And this is a process that actually begins in the 70s and 80s as work, especially in the United States, seems to be becoming increasingly computerized, technologized, and it's beginning to move out of traditional workplaces and into the home. And that was one of the biggest differences that people really saw when they started bringing personal computers home, was that all of a sudden there was no clearly defined boundary between work and play. And that's something I think that very much we still struggle with today. All right. So that's one thing that's happening there. The other thing that's happening is on the domestic work front, we're seeing a radical reorganization of labor. So new technologies and new managerial techniques, which were sometimes called piecework, homework, pay for performance, or virtual staffing had several pretty intense results. One was that much of labor became feminized. And what I mean when I say that is that both male and female employees suddenly were finding themselves thrown into the kind of low skill, low pay, low security employment patterns that have been traditionally associated with women. So the kinds of job insecurity and economic insecurity that women have often struggled with suddenly seem to affect everyone, regardless of sex or gender. The other thing that happened is that with the rise of a consumer-oriented information economy, we see increasing connections, interestingly, between women and new technologies. So as you may remember, I had said that in earlier moments of feminism, many women, not all, but many women felt that science and technology just wasn't that important of an issue necessarily. But by the 1970s and 80s, it's really obvious that we're going to have to rethink our assumptions about sex, gender, and technology, because suddenly women are indeed working with these new technologies and they're on the front of the new post-industrial economy, especially as secretaries and telemarketers who at that point were often working more closely with computers than anyone else but reaping the least benefits of them. All right. Okay. The other thing, of course, was that we started to recognize that this wasn't happening just in the United States, of course, that issues of science and technology and sex and gender are being reorganized on the global work front as well as the domestic one. So while first world countries like the United States seemed to be moving primarily towards white collar work, someone still had to make all those computer chips and consoles that enabled that kind of invisible labor or digital labor. So new practices such as outsourcing allowed first world countries to move low skill, low pay, industrial oriented labor to third world countries where many, if not most of those new positions were filled by girls and women. Having said that, work was not always outsourced. One of the things that we increasingly recognize is that work was also, maybe you want to call it insourced, but taken into sort of remote corners of the United States where once again, so there's still factory work happening in the United States. And interestingly, the majority of people who are doing that work at that point are once again going to be women and girls, and often immigrant women and girls. So again, there's a need to think past the boundaries of the United States and to think past traditional ideas about what constitutes feminism, or especially U.S. feminism. All right. So the third and final thing we see, and you may remember this from an earlier conversation, is the revival of feminist backlash. Every historical era in which feminists have made major gains has then seen within the next few decades a backlash against those gains. A sense that, all right, women, they got what they wanted and needed. Now everyone's equal. We're done with feminism. We don't need to keep talking about these issues. Time for women to move on. Time for everyone to move on, right? And this was especially true in the 1980s. And in fact, as early as 1982, journalists and others in the popular media began talking about the new post-feminist generation. Now, this term has been, and you'll still see it sometimes used by the popular press, to suggest that feminism is no longer necessary or relevant to the lives of women. And I do have to say that following the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment in 1982, the women's movement wasn't completely dead, but it did seem to enter this period of abeyance in which the most prominent feminists of the previous decade left the public eye. Furthermore, what you did see was a certain trend amongst some younger feminists who were trading in their political ideas for career mobility. And sometimes you would see younger women talking about career goals and as really the only thing they needed to worry about, and viewing feminism as a kind of anachronism. Of course, popular notions about post-feminism didn't actually match the reality of many women's lives. And so it's no surprise that the actual situation for women in the 80s and 90s as a group and as members of other groups were going to actually lead instead not to the end of feminism or to a post-feminist era, but instead to a new wave of feminism itself. And I actually have to say, this is pretty funny. I was thinking about this today, that as a third wave feminist myself, I remember being, especially in the 1990s, really struggling against that term post-feminism. And one of the first essays I actually published was one that was called "I'll Be a Post-Feminist in a Post-Patriarchy." And as you might imagine, I was not buying the post-feminism argument there. Anyways, so that's just a little point that I thought I'd share with you. So these are the things that are going to lead. So we've got 3 external factors and 1 internal factor that's leading feminists to start thinking about how we might transform second wave feminisms into modern feminisms that would capture the increasingly complex realities of science and technology and sex and gender for women, not just in the United States, but across the world. And this is going to lead to the rise of what will become third wave feminism. And in fact, you'll be reading an essay this week called "Becoming the Third Wave." Now, there are 2 major issues at stake in third wave feminisms. The first has to do with the transformation in how feminists are going to do politics. So what we're going to see is an embrace of affinity politics or coalition politics. I don't care which one you call it. You'll see those words used interchangeably. But let me explain what I mean by affinity and coalition politics. As we've discussed in earlier segments of this class, the first 2 waves of American feminism typically assumed that all women were naturally united in 2 ways: by their fundamental biological similarities, because all women have uteruses and have the potential to give birth. They are bound together, supposedly, by these biological similarities and experiences. And of course, by their fundamentally similar experiences of oppression under patriarchy. In other words, then, all women could be represented by the same biological and cultural woman with a capital W. Now, of course, if you were a second wave lesbian feminist, you might have spelled that WOMYN or WIMIN, lots of different ways, but you still would have had that capital W, and you would have even still sort of seen, excuse me, a sense that that the categories are fairly universal, and that a lot of people's experience will indeed still fit into these neat boxes. Okay, but with the rise of Reaganism and the rapid spread of multinational capitalism, it became increasingly clear that one's position in the integrated circuit does indeed depend on one's race and nationality. So what we're seeing is that, so 2 things are happening, right? So we're coming out of 200 years of identity politics. So just so you know, when we talk about all women as having a similar experience, that's called identity politics. And identity politics are really important, and we still use them today, and with good reason. It's easy to organize around identity groups. We like to be part of in-groups. We like to see ourselves in others and in other groups, and it's a powerful way to argue for things. So for instance, if groups of mothers of all different races and ethnicities come together, for instance, at a protest and say, as mothers, we don't want this kind of action to happen in the world, it tends to get a lot of press. It's easy to talk about. It's easy to send a signal. It's a very powerful way to work. However, as lesbian and Black feminists were already and had been noting all along, quite frankly, right, maybe the category of woman wasn't quite as monolithic as people had thought. And by the time we get to the 70s and 80s and the rise of a global capitalism that clearly is putting women in different parts of what we call the integrated circuit of capitalism based on their race and class and nationality, even the most resistant, I think, of conventional, mainstream, maybe even white, middle-class American feminists had to begin recognizing that not all women really have the same experience, that we may have broadly similar experiences, but not the exact same ones. Right. And in particular, we're going to see African American and U.S. third world feminists pointing out that the kind of woman imagined by earlier feminisms tends to be implicitly white and middle class. Again, this is things that we've been discussing since the beginning of the semester, so this probably isn't a terrible surprise to you, but it was pretty big news to lots of feminists in the 1980s and 1990s. All right. So based on these insights, an increasing number of feminists, most obviously led by Rebecca Walker, who you'll be reading, but also by Donna Haraway and Shayla Sandoval on the academic front, began to call for new kinds of critical and analytic categories through which to think about women's experiences and identities. And one thing you're going to see is that since the 1980s and 90s, we've seen an explosion of hybrid images and metaphors used to talk about the kind of complex hybrid experiences we have when we inhabit multiple worlds with multiple identities. So to think about how you can be both female and black, let's say, or perhaps, let's say, trans and Asian, you'll see people start to use images such as the bastard child or the mestiza or even the cyborg, right? So images of fabulous mythical creatures or beings that defy simple categorization, right? So we're going to see that kind of imagery become important. And then the kind of politics that will be associated with it, like I said, is often called affinity or coalition politics. And what this means, this is a much more flexible kind of politics than identity politics in some ways. Affinity and coalition politics assumes that people have diverse experiences because they come from diverse backgrounds and move through the world in diverse ways. They also assume, however, that we do indeed often have common causes, and that, for instance, women from around the world might come together for a specific cause, or perhaps even that feminists might work together with other kinds of political progressive actors to pursue various agendas. So, for instance, you might have feminists working with civil rights activists or LGBTQIA activists on some sort of legislation to do with sex and gender equality. Or you might even see, and we did see this in the 1980s, some feminists who teamed up, for instance, with conservative Christians to argue against pornography and to try to enact legislation regulating and eliminating pornography. So that's the kind of interesting thing about affinity and coalition politics that I want you to hear. Sometimes it will look a lot like identity politics. It really will be women marching together or pro-science people marching together or whatever. Sometimes it's going to look much more fantastical and creative and even strange, like some of these metaphors I'm talking about, right? And that sometimes you're going to find that groups who you wouldn't normally think come together do come together. But again, remember, this is affinity or coalition politics. What we assume is that these alliances are temporary and that groups work together to achieve common goals, and then that they will respectfully agree to disagree and to move apart when they've achieved that goal. So the advantage of affinity politics or coalition politics is this incredible flexibility, that it's not just like, okay, everyone's going to put all their eggs in one basket and make a big run up to universal suffrage and then, it's over. What do we do? Now, instead you assume, okay, we're going to work together for a few moments on certain kinds of agendas, and then we will go our separate ways. Now, in some ways, obviously, this is a really utopian idea because you're assuming that all these different actors can get together and talk through their agendas rationally. And as we know, humans are complex people, and sometimes we're rational and sometimes we're not. For others, this seemed kind of frightening because it seemed like the end of identity politics and the end of any clear line of clearly feminist politics or clearly progressive or clearly conservative politics. I'll leave that up to you to decide. Personally, I think it's kind of a cool, flexible way to think about being in the world. And in a moment when we often find it difficult to talk across identity lines to each other, I think that if we can embrace affinity and coalition politics and look for the moments when seemingly opposed people do indeed have things in common, that could indeed lead to the rebuilding of a truly civil society. Okay. So let's move on now to the second issue. And I think that that's an issue that you would see a lot of third wave feminists express a hope in as well. So even as I'm telling you this, I'm sort of saying this as someone who has lived through and experienced third wave feminism, and that I feel that that's something you would hear a lot of third wave feminists say. All right, cool. So let's talk about the other issue. The other big issue you see in third wave feminism has to do with feminism and technology. So again, as I mentioned earlier in this lecture, and as we've discussed earlier in the semester, feminists have often assumed that women and their concerns were fundamentally opposed to those of men. And so, and as long as we associate science and technology with men, then for a lot of feminists, it seemed like it wasn't anything we needed to really talk about. Either science and technology were simply part of the patriarchal world that we weren't going to deal with, or it was part of the world that needed reform. All right. So even as that's happening, of course, now, having said that, I want to make clear, like from day one, you can find feminists who are interested in science and technology. I would remind you, of course, of Mary Wollstonecraft and Mary Shelley, both of whom were very well versed in natural philosophy, which is what science was called in their day. They went to public science experiments. They wrote about it frequently in their work. So I don't want to say feminists weren't interested in science and technology. There always have been ones who have been, and it would be a great final paper, in fact, for some of you. And this is work I've done as well. Having said that, I would say that science and technology become major concerns for feminists of all different sorts in the 1980s and 90s as we really begin to see the transformation of both our domestic and our work lives due to advanced sciences and technologies, right? Okay. So what we're going to see is that there are a number of groups who will be working in different areas, trying to think through the impact of science and technology on sex and gender. So a couple of the groups I want to mention, because you're going to be looking at them this week. So obviously we're going to see some academics talking about this, but really two major popular groups that you want to think about. The first were the Riot Girls, okay? And you want to spell that GRRRLS. So the Riot Girls were groups of musicians who came out of the punk and post-punk movements and were very much opposed to the ongoing masculinist impulses in music. This is something I remember growing up too, is I played guitar in bands, and I remember boys telling me, oh, there's never been a great girl guitarist. And I was thinking, Joan Jett, Lita Ford, the women from Heart. So I wasn't really sure what they were looking at, but that's the kind of rhetoric that you would definitely hear through the 70s, the 80s, and even through the 90s, right? But the Riot Girls very much pushed back against that. And some of the bands who you might associate with the Riot Girl movement are Bikini Kill, Hole. Some of you may know Courtney Love. She was the lead singer of Hole. L7. I'm forgetting some of the other ones that I wanted to mention. But those are good ones for you to know. And in particular, keep your eye out, because you're going to be reading an essay from Kathleen Hanna, who was the lead singer for Bikini Kill, for this unit, all right? So you're going to be reading a piece by a Riot Girl, all right? So while you've got the Riot Girls are saying that women should take back music and magazines, right? So they're going to be very much on the punk scene. They're talking about taking back guitars, taking back the zine, the zine scene. That sounds weird, but you see what I'm saying? And taking back music-oriented technologies in general. You're going to see an explosion of women-oriented music festivals in the 1990s. You remember I had mentioned that there had been a number of women's separatist music festivals that were established in the 1970s. In the 1990s, what you're going to get are women going out on tour together, competing with Lollapalooza, competing with the Vans tours, etc. And the big one from the 1990s was the Lilith's Fair tour. All right. The other group who you're going to see, feminist groups who are going to be taking back science and technology and reworking those conventional connections between science, technology, and sex and gender, are going to be the cyber feminists. And I've given you a cyber feminist reading for this unit as well by VNS Matrix. And we're going outside the United States. They are an Australian feminist art collective who were really significant in leading the charge to rethink who owned the internet. Okay. Right. So together, so you're going to have all of these, so you're going to have the Riot Girls and the cyber feminists working out in popular culture on the popular front. And then in academia, you're going to have a couple major theorists who are rethinking the relations of science, technology, and sex and gender. I'm not actually asking you to read them for this unit, but I'm going to give you their names because any one of them would make for a great final project. The first and most important one was Donna Haraway, and she wrote an essay called A Manifesto for Cyborgs. And in that manifesto, she famously claimed, I would rather be a cyborg than a goddess. And for her, that sort of summed up the difference between third and second wave feminism, whereas second wave feminism focused on identity politics and the natural and the relationship of woman to the goddess within. Haraway says, we're not natural. We're creatures of culture and science and technology. And our connections to each other are impartial and messy and weird, just the way cyborgs' connections are to themselves. Right? The cyborg is something that's part organic and part technological. And once you put it together, it's a being that is its own thing. You can't take it back apart into its component selves. And so Haraway said, all of us as modern day high-tech feminists are really cyborgs rather than goddesses. I think these days people would like to say, I'd like to be a cyborg goddess empress and put it all together. But again, you want to realize that in that shift from second to third wave feminism, it was important to make those distinctions. Other important feminists from this period whom you may come across include Shayla Sandoval, who was one of the first scholars to think about women of color in the integrated circuit. And so she sort of takes the ideas that Donna Haraway is working with and applies them on a global stage. Another important person is Rosie Braidotti, who worked often with the cyber feminists and who took a lot of the art action that they were doing and translated their work into more academic and scholarly kinds of manifestos. Okay, cool. So that is actually it, my friends, for third wave feminisms. I do want to remind you that third wave feminists, like their predecessors, often embrace other frameworks as well. So you can easily have a third wave Marxist feminist or a third wave lesbian separatist feminist or a third wave womanist even, I would think. The key thing, though, is that once you're identifying as part of the third wave rather than the second wave or earlier waves of feminism, that you're rejecting the myth of unity amongst women, and you're embracing the multiplicity of women's identities, recognizing that there'll be a lot of overlap. So it's not the end of feminist politics. It's instead the shift into a more complex feminist politics, right? And then the other thing, of course, is thinking about the relationship of science and technology, both in terms of how our lives are already shaped in many ways by our place within the integrated circuits of capitalism, and also how we can use science and technology to push back, to live long and prosper, and to make more spaces for ourselves. Okay, cool. And that's it. Great. So what I'd like you to do then is, as you're going through your readings, look for these kinds of emphases that I'm talking about here. Where do you see our authors sorting through the multiplicity of women's identities rather than the idea of a unified identity? Where do you see them arguing for conversation with other women and other people across identity boundaries? And where do you see arguments for using science and technology differently, either to push forward feminist agendas, to express women's experiences of the world, or to do art and have fun? Because that's one of the important things that Rosie Braidotti talked about, is that we want to have a revolution, but we want to have fun while we're doing it. And I think that that's something important to remember. We talked about this with first wave feminism. Remember when Emma Goldman said, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution? And we want to see a similar kind of attitude here with third wave feminists as well. And it's not just that they want to dance to their own revolution, but that they want to choreograph the music to it as well, and then broadcast it on their own terms. All right, cool. All right, so now that we've talked about third wave feminisms, I want to take a few minutes, as always, to talk about main issues in the LGBTQIA rights movement as it unfolded over the 1980s and 1990s. Before we jump into that, let's take a moment and remind ourselves of what happened in LGBTQIA rights in the 1970s. As you may remember, LGBT plus activists, much like feminists, made a lot of gains in the 1960s and 70s. And I'm going to remind you for a few of the gains of the 1970s right now. In 1977, the Supreme Court ruled that transgender tennis player Renee Richards could play at the United States Open as a woman. So that was huge, 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 huge in sports. We also saw the first openly gay elected officials in this period. Kathy Kozachenko won a seat to the Ann Arbor, Michigan City Council in 1974, becoming the first out American to be elected to public office. Harvey Milk, who campaigned on a pro-gay rights platform, became the San Francisco City Supervisor in 1978, becoming the first openly gay man elected to a political office in California. At that same time, Milk asked Gilbert Baker, an artist and gay rights activist, to create an emblem that would represent the movement and be seen as a symbol of pride. Baker designed and stitched together the first rainbow flag, which he unveiled at a pride parade in 1978. And as you know, today we have multiple flags for the LGBTQIA movement, and I understand that there is even talk of redesigning the original rainbow flag. Maybe it's already happened and it's past me, but I know that I've seen chat about that in order to recognize and honor the diversity and the growth of the LGBTQIA movement since 1978. Okay. In 1979, then, more than 100,000 people took part in the first National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. So through the 60s and 70s, we see LGBTQIA activists like feminists making real legislative and cultural gains. And then the 1980s and 1990s hits, and it becomes a more complex scenario. What we'll see is that in the 1980s, the LGBTQIA movement is radically transformed by the advent of HIV/AIDS. So, in 1981, the CDC reported that gay men were catching a new kind of pneumonia. By 1984, the HIV virus had been identified, and by 1986, the first antiretroviral medications for HIV were available. So, obviously, in many ways, this was a setback for the gay community in terms of how many straight people perceived that community. HIV/AIDS was originally misunderstood as a gay virus and often talked about by more conservative members of our culture as God's punishment on people who had broken the word of God, I suppose, right? And so we're going to see a lot of, and even people who don't necessarily feel that way, there's going to be a lot of anxiety about this. It was a plague, it was a pandemic, just like we're living through now. Having said it, it was a pandemic that only seemed to be hitting certain populations at that time. And it did cause a great deal of anxiety on the part of all sorts of people. Now, at the same time, this became, not a wake-up call, but a rallying, a cause to rally within the LGBTQIA community. And what you'll see actually is that gay rights proponents are very quick to respond to the AIDS HIV pandemic and to misassumptions that this was a purely gay disease. So, for instance, we'll see that gay rights proponents held the second National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights in 1987. And this occasion actually marked the first national coverage of ACT UP, which was the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, an advocacy group that seeks to improve the lives of AIDS victims and to provide the general public with an education on the realities of HIV and AIDS. In 1988, the World Health Organization declared December 1st to be World AIDS Day, and increasingly we saw members of various communities, after sort of an initial freak out, maybe about it, panic, buckle down to try to find a way to end and manage this. And I'd point out that how many years later now, we still don't actually have a vaccine for that particular pandemic, although we do have many, many excellent treatments that allow people to live long and healthy lives. And so I think that this is an important thing to think about, that while people were really panicked and terrified about this, we have, led by gay rights activists, we have learned that this is not a gay disease or anything like that, but it is a disease that does target specific kinds of populations at certain times. And gay rights activists have been really, especially those who are associated with ACT UP and then subsequent education groups, have been at the forefront of public education and pushing for more innovative scientific paths of research. All right, cool. So if the 1990s was all about AIDS and how that shaped and reshaped both public perceptions of the LGBTQIA community, and as it shaped and reshaped the kinds of activism that were happening within that community, the 1990s brought their own challenges to LGBTQIA people in the form of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and Defense of Marriage Acts. All right, so let's talk about that a little bit. In 1992, the District of Columbia passed a law that allowed gay and lesbian couples to register as domestic partners, granting them some of the same rights of marriage. And then the city of San Francisco passed a similar ordinance, actually a few years earlier. California would later, in 1999, let me try that again. All right, 1992, the District of Columbia passed a law that allowed gay and lesbian couples to register as domestic partners. The city of San Francisco had already done that in 1989. And in 1999, this whole state of California would embrace the idea of a domestic partnership registration. In 1992, as Bill Clinton campaigned for president, he promised that he would lift the ban against gays in the military. And so it seemed that after this first sort of initial fear and shock and confusion around AIDS, as that settled out, people seemed to be turning back again and thinking about the progress of gay rights. Unfortunately, Clinton could not garner enough support for lifting the ban against gays in the policy. So in 1993, he passed the Don't Act, Don't Tell policy, which allowed gay men and women to serve in the military as long as they kept their sexuality a secret. Not exactly a win as far as anyone was concerned. Slow progress, maybe in the long picture of history, but it was very disappointing at the time. Certainly, people had hoped, feminists and other progressive activists had hoped for more. Obviously, so had the LGBTQIA community, right? All right, great. Okay, in 1996, Congress passed the Defense of Marriage Act, which Clinton signed into law in that same year. That law prevented the government from granting federal marriage benefits to same-sex couples and allowed states to refuse to recognize same-sex marriage certificates that had been issued in other states. So, while we see setbacks in military and marriage rights, gay rights activists actually did score some other victories. So let's end on a positive note and think about those. In 1994, a new anti-hate crime law allowed judges to impose harsher sentences if a crime was motivated by a victim's sexual orientation. And so these kinds of slow but steady gains would continue throughout the 1990s and eventually into the 2000s, when we will eventually talk about other kinds of things, including the legalization of gay marriage. But we'll be saving that for our final lecture on fourth wave feminism and other progressive political activities. All right, my friends, and so that's it. There you have it. Third wave feminisms in a nutshell, as well as a brief overview of LGBTQIA rights in the 1980s and 1990s. I'll look forward to talking with you about this next week. Bye now.